All right. Well, we were out of 1 Samuel for a couple weeks. Jacob preached one Sunday, and then we had Mother's Day. And we are back in 1 Samuel. I hope you got the memo that your homework was to read chapter 23 and 24. And so that's the narrative portion we're going to cover today. And I want to build some context. I want to remind you of some things that we've already talked about that are going to be important for understanding what's happening today. So we'll start with the notes. It's called the context. So number one, David has been chosen and anointed to be Israel's next king. The only question is when. So remember that he was probably 10 to 14, maybe 16 years old, most likely in the 10 to 14 age group when he was anointed as king. Samuel came out. He was so unlikely the choice that his dad didn't even bring him in to see the prophet who said, I'm going to anoint one of your children as king. He was kind of the leftover. He was the forgotten child. But he was anointed king by Samuel. And 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds don't become king when there's already a king on the throne. There have been times in history and actually times in the Bible where children became king because their father died and they were next in line. But David's father was not the king, and he was not next in line by those standards. Saul was still the king, and Saul had a son named Jonathan who would be next in line by all worldly measures. So David is a kid when he's anointed. The promise is you will be the next king of Israel. And then he spends the next 10, 15, maybe even close to 20 years waiting to become the king. And that's really important to have in your memory when we get to the text today. Number 2 in your notes, Saul has been on his own without any help from God for 10 plus years, over 10 years. Remember when Saul disobeyed God and God said, I'm taking my spirit from you? Saul remained king, but he was completely on his own, all for his own thoughts, his own wisdom, listening to whoever he wanted to listen to. And he did a good job as a military leader. He won a lot of battles, but he fell apart spiritually and he fell apart mentally. And so we have a king who's a bit off tilt, if you will. He's definitely obsessing about David, and he's been doing this for over 10 years. So we have David waiting to be the next king because God promised him. And we have Saul who remains the king even though he's a bit unhinged. Number 3, David, Saul, and Jonathan all know that David will be the next king. It's not a secret anymore. The word is out. People have figured this out. Okay? They all know this is going to happen. So David is willing and is waiting for God to make it happen. And that's really important. He's capable. We've seen him rise up as a leader, and he's willing, but he's waiting. He's waiting for God to make the move. He's not trying to make the move for God. So that's where David's at. Jonathan has accepted this and desires to assist David 100%. And I just want to reference one verse in chapter 23, verse 17. It says, this is Jonathan speaking to David. It says, don't be afraid, he said. My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. And even my father Saul knows this. So everyone's aware. Jonathan has the best attitude. Jonathan should be a hero in our minds because he says, okay, my father's king. I would normally get the throne after him, but God has chosen you, and so I'm going to go with God. I will support you. When you're king, I'll be your number 2 guy. That was Jonathan's attitude, and it was awesome. And then there's number C, Saul. Saul rejected the idea and tries to kill David several times. Matter of fact, he's been trying to kill David ever since. He's been chasing him around. He's failed on 3 or 4 occasions. He's tried to send others. He's tried to do it himself. And that brings us to this point in the story. David is hiding. Saul is in pursuit. And Jonathan is trying to de-escalate the situation. So we have all this going on. That brings us to chapter 23, We're going to not read that chapter. We're going to just use our notes. I hope you've read it ahead of time. If not, you can go back and read it. But here's how the story progresses. Number one, David hears that the city of Keilah is in danger from the Philistines and goes to their defense. So the Philistines attack this city. David hears about it. David has a priest with him with an ephod. And a priest and an ephod you can ask questions and God will speak through that process. You can read about that in a history book or an encyclopedia. It was the way that God prescribed for someone to ask questions of him and then him provide an answer. So he went to the priest and he said, should I go defend these people? Should I take my 400 men and go defend this city? And the answer came back, yes. And so he told his men, hey, we're going to go defend the city. We're going to fight the Philistines. And his men, their response was, we're already in danger from Saul while we're hiding. Like we're trying to avoid Saul. And if we go and attack the Philistines at this city, Saul's going to know exactly where we're at. We're going to be even more danger. Maybe you didn't hear right. And so David goes back and he asks the question of God again. God says, yes, go defend the city. And David comes back and says, guys, we're going. God said to go. So they go. And we need to know that process because that's David checking in with God to make sure that he's doing what God wants him to do. Very important in understanding what's coming up in the narrative. And so in your notes, God uses this series of events to solidify David as a leader of this armed group and illustrate that David is God's chosen man to lead them. So in this process, they know that David can hear from God. He is God's chosen. They go and have victory. And it's not likely that these and they could be up to 500 men now. They probably were gathering people along the way. This 400 or 500 group army is not likely to go defeat the Philistines who are attacking a city. That's bad odds. But when God sends you, God goes with you. And when they went and they had victory, it showed these men that they really were fighting on God's side of the battle. So that was a good thing that God did. But Saul does hear about it. Number two, he hears about David and he goes on the chase. And in his mind is, this is great. He's going to defend the city. They're going to win the battle. They're going to go inside. They're going to have a big party. All the people are going to say, great job. Stay for a while. They're going to stay. I'll get there. It's a gated city with a wall. When I get there, he won't be able to get out. He'll be trapped. And now I've got him. That was Saul's intent. But David heard about this. And again, he inquired of the Lord. That's number three. David inquires of God regarding the city and Saul. And he said, if Saul comes, are the people going to give me up to him? And God said, yes, they will. And so David said, well, I better leave then. He didn't want to cause any more damage to the city. He didn't want the people to give him up. He didn't want any of that to happen. So David and his men go back to the wilderness in hiding. So they came out in public. They fought the Philistines. They realized they are, in fact, in danger, and they went back into hiding in the wilderness. Then number four, the Ziphites, who I don't remember ever hearing about before. And I don't really remember hearing anything about them again, but they're a group of people, and they decided that if they turned David over to Saul, Saul would be beholding to them. They saw it as a political move. Like if we give the king his enemy David, then the king will treat us well. So they had this thought, and they turned him over to Saul, and Saul said, well, make sure you know where he's at. And they said, we know where he's at. And so Saul comes after them, and there's going to be an encounter. So the Ziphites sell out David. God saves them, and it's God. It's not David. David didn't have this great plan. What happened was one army's marching up this side of a mountain. Probably don't think of a big mountain. Think of KM. Why that's called a mountain, I have no idea. But marching up one side of the mountain, and Saul's army's marching up the other side of the mountain. It doesn't seem like Saul knows where David is, but David probably knows where Saul is. They're marching. They don't have anywhere to go. When they get to the other side, there's going to be a battle. So what are they going to do? Well, God causes the Philistines to attack another city. Word gets to Saul. Saul fulfills his duty as king and goes to defend that city. when David comes around the corner, there's nobody there. And so they didn't meet and they didn't fight. There wasn't a battle. There was no Israeli on Israeli fight going on there. But God did that. What did God do by doing that? Think of this. If they had met, if up-and-coming David, commander of 400 to 600 men, former commander of thousands in the Israeli army, if that David had met Saul with his group of men and they battled it out, and let's say that Saul died, it's not like everyone would just say, oh, great, now David can be king. Yay. No, there would have been civil war because Saul had his supporters. And they would have seen David as an assassin or as a rebel or someone trying to pull off a coup. And it would not have done what God intended to do for David. So God diverted Saul's army, and so that never took place. We read about that in chapter 23. And then David moves his men to a safer place in the strongholds of En-Gedi. And again, he was going to live in caves where they could hide and they could survive for a long time if necessary. So now, chapter 24. I do want to read chapter 24. I want us to go through this. This is the part I want to highlight today. And so it says, after Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. 3,000 men, David has 400 to 500. Saul fully intends to wipe them out completely. He does not intend to go have a conversation. He does not intend to arrest David. He intends to kill David and anyone that gets in between him and that killing. So he takes 3,000 of his best men. He's seen David in action. He's seen God give. He's bringing overwhelming force so that he'll be sure and gain the victory. Verse 3. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. It's exactly what it sounds like. Okay? Yeah. Went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. So Saul goes in to relieve himself. David and his men are hiding in the deep parts of the cave. You got to understand, Saul did not go in the cave with people. He went in the cave by himself. He probably left 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 people at the mouth of the cave and said, guys, I got business to take care of in the cave. You wait here. I don't want you joining me. Okay, so he walked in the cave. He found a spot. He took off his armor and his sword and all the extra stuff he had, probably down to his undergarments, which would have been a dress-looking thing. And then he left that pile of stuff and went over to a nice spot he had chosen to take care of his business. And of course, David's men are watching. They report to David, hey, Saul came in the cave all by himself. He's relieving himself. His armor is all in a pile over there. He is completely defenseless. So verse 4, the men said, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Now I want to stop here. If you've read ahead, you kind of know what happens. And I just want to say that at this point in time, David is not tempted to kill Saul. We might think that he got up there ready to kill Saul, knife in hand, spear in hand, arrow in hand, ready to kill Saul, and then thought better of it. No, he moved forward. His intent was to get a piece of his robe. He had no intention of killing Saul. He never had that intention, even though the men thought that was the best idea. Turns out David even felt guilty about cutting the corner off of his robe, which was lying on a rock somewhere. Verse 5, afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off the corner of his robe. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hands on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. So he went and got the corner of the robe, and his men were like, David, you got to kill him right now. He's defenseless. He's unarmed. There's no one to get in the way. They're basically volunteering. Send me. I'll go. I'll do it. We'll all do it together. There's no way. This is God giving you the victory. You have to take it. And David, who wouldn't go that route, felt guilty about cutting the corner off the robe. And he comes back and he says, guys, what you want to do is not right. God put him in position as king, and it will be God who removes him. It's not going to be me, and it's not going to be you. And he had a pretty harsh conversation with his men. They weren't his mighty men yet. They were still disgruntled, tax-owing, partially criminal people who joined him. That was his army. And it says, as Saul left the cave and went his way, he had no idea that any of this had happened. Verse 8, then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, my lord the king. When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground, showing honor to the king. Verse 9, he said to Saul, why do you listen when men say David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. And this is kind of a little ironic because Saul has not yet seen how he was delivered. But David's like, you don't even know, but you're about to find out how you were right there and I could have killed you. He says, some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord, who is the Lord's anointed. See my father, and he calls him father because he has been like a son, welcomed at his table, welcomed in his court. He was treated like a son for so long. He says, see my father, look at the piece of your robe in my hand, and he held it up. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I am guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. He says, I haven't done anything, yet you're trying to kill me. He says, I'm so sure I haven't done anything. This is what he says in verse 12. May the Lord judge between you and me. He's saying, let God be the judge. Quit trying to kill me. If I've done something, let God deal with me. And may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me by my hand, but my hand will not touch you. He says, if God's going to do anything to you, it'll be him that does it, not me. I'm not going to touch you. As the old saying goes, from evil doers come evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you. He says, I'm going to keep my side of the street clean. I'm not going to do what you're doing. I'm just going to do what God asked me to do. And so I'm not trying to hurt you. Why are you trying to hurt me? Verse 14. Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Who are you pursuing? A dead dog? A flea? Like I'm a nobody. May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand. And at that point, Saul would have to say, he has vindicated you because he has delivered you from my hand so many times. He delivered you from my spear at least 3 times. He delivered you from my men that I sent to get you at least 3 times. He delivered you when I tried to trap you in your house, and he delivered you when I tried to trap you in the city. So yes, the Lord has vindicated you. And so Saul would understand that. Verse 16. When David finished saying this, Saul asked, is that your voice, David, my son? Now, he obviously knew who it was. He wasn't going, is that you, David? He was acknowledging that what David said was true. He says, yeah, you are my son. That's you, my son. Kind of like, I wasn't following your logic, but now I am. I understand what you're saying. You're David, my son. And he wept aloud. That always weird to me. Here's the king. He's trying to kill somebody. Somebody comes out and says, King, I could have killed you, but I didn't. We're supposed to be like father and son. Why are you trying to kill me? And then the king wept aloud. Well, it's an emotional response that was not that uncommon in that day. It'd be weird today. It was not that uncommon in that day. He's acknowledging that David has gotten through to him. He says, "You are more righteous than I. You have treated me well, and I have treated you badly. You have just now told me about the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today." And then verse 20, "I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands." He acknowledges this, maybe for the first time out loud. Verse 21, "Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not kill off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family." He acknowledges that he's going to be the next king, and he says, "Please don't kill my kids. Please don't kill my grandchildren." And David gave his oath to Saul, which was not a surprise because he had already given that same oath to Jonathan. Then Saul returned home, but David and his men went to the stronghold. David didn't say, "Oh, good, we're okay now. I'll come home with you." David said, "I've heard this before. We've seen how this works. I'm just going to stay here in the wilderness for a while." Saul went home. David stayed. So that's chapter 24. That's the end. That's where we're going to get to today. Let's go back to our notes. Let's flesh out a few things. Number one, David's situation as the anointed one was threefold. So A, he was promised that he'd be king by Samuel. So he knows it's valid. He knows it's from God. There's no doubt about it. The things God has done in his life, he knows that he's been promised the kingdom. B, he was not told when this would take place, but it was obviously not right away. Okay, when he was anointed, he didn't know when it was. It was obviously a long ways away, but it really does seem like it should be now. He's been serving the king. He's been leading the army for 10, 12, 15 years. And now Saul's been chasing him around for several years. And it just seems like the right time for Saul to exit and for David to come in. So this is going on. I know I'm going to be king. I don't know when I'm going to be king, but it sure seems like it should be soon. But see, God had not given any more instruction to David regarding a change. So God told him more than a decade in advance, you're going to be king one day. God directed his path. He's interacted with Samuel several times. He's gone through all this stuff, and God has never said next week, next month, next year. He's never said do this, do that. He's always just indicated that what you're doing right now is what I want you to do. Serve the nation, serve the king, serve me. I'll let you know when things change. And so that's the situation we're in. He's been promised, he doesn't know when, and God hasn't given him any more information. So number two, humanly speaking, by everyone who's there, and probably all of us, if we didn't have the story to read, humanly speaking, God had delivered Saul right into the hands of David. In chapter 24, verse 4, all the men say, this is exactly what God promised. He's delivering Saul into your hands. And then in verse 18, Saul says, the Lord delivered me into your hands. By human standards, this is 100% God setting David up for victory. It would have been super easy. A, Saul was alone and undefended. He had no bodyguards close by. He was all by himself. And B, Saul was vulnerable and unarmed. His sword was probably laying with his cloak. David could have stole his sword, killed him with his own sword if he wanted to. So humanly speaking, this is a perfect setup. But number three, spiritually speaking, David was not in the habit of stepping out in front of God. And that whole concept of being a man after God's own heart that we read about later, that's the title he's given, the man after God's own heart. This is part of that. David's not going to move till God says move. Remember, like the Philistines are attacking. Should I go defend the city? Seems like an easy answer. But David asked God before he goes. And then when the men are like, well, we're not sure, he goes, I'll ask again. And he asks God again. And when God says go, he gets up and goes. This has been his practice. This has been who he is. He asks God before he does something. And so now to jump ahead of God would have been a problem. He probably remembered, in your notes, what this had done to Saul. Remember, Saul couldn't wait for Samuel to get there to make the sacrifice, so he did it himself. And so in essence, he couldn't wait for God, so he took on the job himself, and that messed him up. That was his first strike. And then when they defeated the enemy, and God said, don't bring any of their stuff home. Don't take any plunder. Not one thing or one person should come back to camp. And Saul, as the king, decided, hey, I'm a king. I should bring home a king's ransom. And he brought home all the stuff. And he brought home the people. And that was the final strike. That's when God said, I'm done with you. And so David would remember that. And that would have helped him with this decision not to step out in front of God. Yeah, I could kill the king, and I would have that problem solved, but is this what God wants me to do? And God didn't say do it, so he didn't do it. B, he also knew that he would be breaking his healthy patterns, the things he had been doing correctly, always checking with God first. So number 4, David chose to take the higher spiritual ground and spare Saul's life. He took the higher ground. He said, I'm not doing anything God hasn't told me to do. And even though this would be easy pickings, and we could all rest for a while because Saul wouldn't be chasing us, and God said I would be king, so that's not an issue. He didn't take matters into his own hands, and he didn't do his own thing. He chose to spiritually respond rather than respond to the pressure from his men and the situation that looked so inviting. Number 5, the result of David's obedience to God's sovereignty, letting him be in charge, and the result of his mercy towards his enemy was Saul's change of heart. Did you catch that? Saul says, man, you're right. You were like a son to me, and you haven't done anything. He says, I'm going to quit chasing you. Now, if you've read ahead, you know Saul doesn't stick to that very long. But at this moment in time, there's repentance. And so there's a change of heart on Saul. But there's relief for David and his men. They don't have to hide in the cave anymore from Saul, at least not for a while. They can go out and take care of their own needs, find their own food, all this kind of stuff. So there's a change of heart in the enemy, and there's relief for David and his men. But number 6, if David had taken Saul's life, it would probably have resulted in great bloodshed and a much more difficult ascension to the throne. This would have definitely been seen as a coup. David murdered King Saul. This would definitely be murder. A guy's going to the bathroom in a cave and you sneak up behind him and kill him. That's not battle death. That's not judgment from a court. That's murder. And when you murder the king, those who are loyal to the king, they decide they need to take justice on you. So it would have been a coup. It would have brought about civil war, and there would have been a lot of revenge killing going on. And so by David not moving forward because God hadn't said it, and God not saying it because he knew what would happen, David saved the lives of most of his men, probably. He saved the nation from going through a civil war. And God just kind of laid it out where David would eventually become king because Saul died in battle. Saul died honorably in battle. And David, who everyone knew would be the next king, got to just kind of walk into the job with no more bloodshed. So God knew what he was doing, and David's obedience allowed this to take place. And then number 7, even with Saul's promise, David stayed away. And I want you to notice that he's not poking the bear. Okay? Saul is a bear, and he will erupt when poked. And David just realizes, I can't be where Saul's at. I can't eat at the king's table anymore. I need to stay here away from everything so that things don't get worse. And so he stayed where he's at. And that's Again, that's the end of the narrative. We'll pick it up again in chapter 25. But I want you to notice some things, and this is the application. Pay close attention to these last three things here. Number one, David skipped the shortcut in order to honor God. He skipped the shortcut. So many of us love the shortcut. The shortcut is appealing. It sounds good. It's faster. We don't see the after effects of the shortcut. We don't think through the outcome. David's men weren't thinking through the outcome. They weren't thinking any farther than Saul will be dead in the cave. Okay, David didn't take the shortcut. It was God's plan for him to go through this process the long way, and God's plan was the best plan. Sometimes God wants us to go through the long version of the ordeal, or the long version of the journey, or the long version of his will, because the long version is the best version, where we learn the most, are prepared the most, and will have the most success when we get there. So I warn you about the shortcuts. Quit taking the shortcuts. Okay? I don't know how to say it more plainly. You know, hopefully we all learned as a kid that shortcuts aren't always the best. Quit pursuing the shortcuts, especially when it comes to God and what he's doing in your life. Number two, please notice that David stopped to think things through from God's perspective. He asked the question, is this really God giving me this opportunity to kill Saul? Has God told me at any point in time that I should kill Saul? Don't you think David had many opportunities to kill Saul before this? David, being young and strong and trained, probably could have killed Saul with his own spear when he threw it at him the second or third time. David probably could have taken his 400 men and ambushed Saul somewhere. When they were traveling on either side of the mountain, Saul didn't know David was there. David could have sent some people over the mountain to pick them off from the top, the high ground. David could have killed Saul other times, but God never gave him that instruction. God never gave him that permission. And David stopped to think it through from God's perspective, and we need to do that. Just because there's an open door doesn't mean God opened it, right? And sometimes we simply see an open door and we go for it. We run to that door. Just because it's open doesn't mean God opened it. We need to ask the question, is this what God would want me to do? Is this something God would allow me to do? Is this God's will? Has God given me any other instruction? Has God given me other wisdom? Is everyone else in my life who are godly telling me this is a bad idea? If they are, maybe I should stop and think about this longer. He stopped to think about things through God's perspective, and he realized this was not God's plan. And he saved a lot of bloodshed. He saved a civil war. He continued through God's plan and walked into the kingdom rather than fighting his way in. Number three, he was willing to wait on God for his promises, even when there seemed to be a pretty good alternative. And I have these other names here because you might remember Abraham. Abraham was given a promise, you're going to have a son. And he watched as he got old and his wife got old. And he started saying, how am I going to have a son? And someone came up with this great idea of, hey, here's Hagar. Why don't you have a son with Hagar and we'll just claim him as our own and then we'll get this ball rolling. God obviously forgot about us and doesn't have a great plan. So let's do this. It's a great shortcut. Abraham should have looked at Sarah and said, oh, silly woman, that's a bad idea. Let's wait on God. But he didn't. He said, okay, that sounds like a great idea. Let's do that. And they went off and it caused all kinds of trouble. He took a shortcut, didn't think from God's perspective. His grandson Jacob, who was promised by God that he would get the blessing and he would carry on the promise, he couldn't wait for God. And when his mom said, hey, your dad's going to give the blessing to Esau, let's do something. I'll make you I'll make you a costume so your blind father will think you're Esau, and you make some soup just like Esau would, and we'll feed it to him, and then you'll get the blessing. Because even though God promised you get the blessing, obviously he's not paying attention and doesn't know what's happening. So we're going to have to help God. We're going to take a shortcut. Jacob did not think this through from God's perspective, and he spent most of his life running from people that wanted to kill him. He ended up in all kinds of trouble. The promise did go through him, but it was a lot harder than if he had just trusted God and said, Mom, God promised I'd get the blessing. God is pretty big and powerful. Let's wait for him. And how different it would have been. And then, of course, Saul, we've talked about Saul. He couldn't wait for Samuel to show up to give the sacrifice. And then he couldn't not take the king's ransom from the battle. And all these guys wound up in trouble. David did not give in to this temptation, but instead passed the test. And he became known as a man after God's own heart. Part of being a man after God's own heart is that he followed God. He sought God. It wasn't that he thought like God or acted like God. It's that he pursued God. The after is he went after. He went after God's heart. He did stray several times, but he always came back. And part of what we see here is an illustration of that. And so the challenge is to be a man after God's own heart. Be a woman after God's own heart. Don't take the shortcut. Think things through from God's perspective and wait for God to fulfill his promise. He's really good at fulfilling his promises. And sometimes we just need to wait for him to do that. Let's pray. Father, thank you for our time. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for the promises that we still have to claim and look forward to. And I pray that you will help us in our minds and in our hearts to wait for you to fulfill the promises, to not run ahead, to not do things on our own, to not take the shortcuts that Satan puts in front of us. I pray that we'll learn to think from your perspective. And I look forward to living that life because it's going to be so much better than running ahead on my own. I pray that for all of us. Amen.